So part of our work on the board is really ensuring that our strategies and our activities are aligned with our mission. And our mission is that we cultivate and expand the knowledge, passion, and generosity of our members to make a positive impact by developing strong relationships, which I think we all have had the benefit of experiencing from, and leveraging the power of collective giving. Our board really focuses on 3 areas, which we'll talk a little bit about today: our strategic work, our generative thinking, and then fulfilling our fiduciary responsibility. And I would say from a working board to a governance board, we're probably somewhat of a hybrid because, as you guys know, we only have 2 staff members, and we're very much a volunteer powered organization. And so while we have a committee cabinet, the board can get involved in some more details. Our vision is to unlock the potential of our community by uniting to fulfill our philanthropic purpose. And then finally, we use our values to really drive our decision-making and our conduct as a board. And those are inclusivity, empathy, curiosity, and impact. And so with that, I am going to say thank you. We're looking forward to talking with you throughout your lunch hour. Please feel free to continue to eat. And I'd like to introduce Katherine Mudge and Jenny Cotner, both of whom serve on our board governance committee. And they're going to talk a little bit more about the board. Thanks, you guys.
Good afternoon, everybody. And as Susan said, please eat if you need to. If you joined early, you heard some of us talking about hash browns because I ate early because eating and talking didn't seem like it would work very well. So I'm going to touch on a couple different things. One, my journey to the board, my role on the board, and then specifically some of what the governance committee does. So it's nice to see Stephanie Kavanaugh on here today because she is one of the key people that led me to Impact Austin. I knew her through a professional organization, and she and another woman invited me to a recruiting event, and I was intrigued and captivated by the idea of collective giving. So my mother had always raised me to donate money, and money went to my church, my schools, food bank, NPR sorts of things, but never kind of the bigger idea of collective giving and the power of investing in certain dedicated programs. And my background's finance and operations, so I absolutely love the idea of the GRC process and funding very specific, well thought out programs that nonprofits are applying for. So that's kind of what led me to Impact Austin. The first thing I did when I joined, kind of right at the end of 2017, was join the GRCs that spring. And Allison Marshall, who is on today's call, was, I forget the exact title, but she was the cat herder on the education, one of the cat herders on the education GRC that year. And I loved my GRC experience, and especially at that time, we were breaking into subcommittees to review specific proposals. And the first friends I really made in Impact Austin came from the women I worked with, not just in the formal GRC meetings, but some of the extra subcommittee meetings we had to do the write-up on the specific grant application we were reviewing. So just love that experience. And at the Discovery Day event that year, I just happened to talk to Sarah Harris because I knew her from some recruiting events. And I'm an introvert, so I was kind of talking to the people I knew. And Sarah was talking to some woman who looked friendly. So I went over and I was, said hello, and we were kind of chatting. And it turned out she was talking to somebody else who was on the board. So I met Lauren Tabor at that point. And it turned out, just as we were visiting, that my skill set in financial planning and analysis was something they thought the board could really use. And so later I was approached after a couple months by Susan and Lauren of, would you be interested in serving on the board? We could really use that analytical skill set. So that's kind of how I ended up on the board. And with that background, of course, the first place I started the first committee I was on and still am on is the Finance Committee. So the Finance Committee does pretty much what you would expect a Finance Committee to do. But then Susan asked if I also wanted to be on the Governance Committee. And I'm like, sure, well, you know, what does the Governance Committee do? So the Governance Committee, and I'll talk more about that in a little bit, but the big things the Governance Committee does is we help govern. So what are some of our key documents, like our bylaws? How does the organization work? We also are responsible for ensuring that the board is being as effective as we can be. So we solicit feedback from board members and others about how we're doing. And we also are responsible for board recruiting. So that's kind of how I started on the board. One of the coolest things I've done on the board, apart from getting to know all the fabulous women that I have serving with, is something you'll hear more about in the coming weeks as we publicize two things that are changing within Impact Austin. As many people know, and I know not everybody on the call is an existing member, we used to really only have one grant cycle that occurred every spring, and we 2 years ago added the Social Innovation Grant in the fall. And the Grants Committee led by Becky Austin, who I saw in here as well, did a lot of work to figure out, go forward, now that we've had, you know, call it 1.5, because we're in the second SIG cycle, very successful pilots of not just the SIG grant, which is focused on a collaborative of organizations coming together to do a specific program. You know, we've also been successful at having 2 grant cycles. You know, how do we really do that, go forward in a thoughtful way? And so they figured all that out, but there was a question around how we figure out how much money to set aside for spring grants and how much to set aside for fall grants. And those of you who are current members are probably aware that this year it's a little goofy because the grants we gave out in spring totaled $100,000 and the grant we're giving out in November totaled, excuse me, totaled only $40,000. So I worked with both the Finance Committee and some of the grants leadership to figure out something called pockets to basically ensure that spring and fall were always treated equal or equitably. It doesn't mean the grant amounts will always be exactly the same, but it means essentially that when a member makes a payment, whether it's annual or using our new monthly payments, half of each payment goes towards spring grants and half goes to fall grants. And the only difference is, you know, which year. So maybe the fall grant money goes to calendar 20 and the spring money goes to calendar 21, but other people might be given to calendar 21 and spring and calendar 21 and fall. But it all works out. So you'll hear more about that as communicated through the marketing team and Judy and Linda, who I think they're both on this call as well. So that was one of the neat things, that being on the board, I got to work across many of the different parts of Impact Austin to make happen. And so that was just, you know, as Susan said, we are very much, you know, kind of split between working and governing. And that's really one of the working board things I got to do. So I really enjoyed that experience, not just because it made or will make a big difference to Impact Austin. I got to work with a lot of the wonderful women who are part of Impact Austin. So that was done more under the auspices of the Finance Committee. Under the Governance Committee, one of the key things I do, and Katherine's kind of my partner in crime, especially this year, is focusing on board recruiting. So we are a volunteer-powered organization, as Susan said, so we need volunteers to help us run the organization at all levels, and that includes the board. And the analogy I like to use for those of you who are more familiar with the organization is, as Impact Austin members, we trust the GRC process to go through all the letters of interest and then narrow it down to who should actually write a grant, and then to review all the grants and figure out if you maybe started with 30, what 2 finalists go to annual meeting. And we trust the GRCs to do that, and we trust the women who vote to figure out, at least historically, of those 2 that go to the annual meeting, which one receives the grant and becomes our community partner. And just as we trust the GRC process, and we trust the women who are voting to determine the community partner, because I try to vote every year because I believe in the organization, but if I happen to miss it, I know that I trust the rest of the organization. That's kind of, in my mind, the same way we use the board. So not every Impact Austin member could or would want to be in the middle of everything. But if you're on, if you trust your board, then you can trust the board to make good decisions on behalf of the organization. So that's how I think about the board. If you are interested after today's session or any future Impact Austin experiences about learning more about board service, please just reach out to me or to Catherine or to Christina or anybody else on the board, and we are happy to tell you more and make the right relationships. And as I think about my time in Impact Austin, and I'm kind of coming up on the 3-year mark now, I still love the core mission of what Impact Austin does and the end result of putting, $100,000 grants or $80,000 or whatever that amount is into a specific program developed by the nonprofit or collection of nonprofits that was asking for it. But I also really love, especially in this crazy 2020, all of the women that I've met and gotten to work with. And if my first friends in Impact Austin were from my subcommittee on the grant review committee, and then in zones, and I see a couple women that I know from zones, and Alice, I'm gonna wave at you, because I've really got to know Alice through my zone. I treasure each and every woman I've met, and however you volunteer within Impact Austin, I encourage people to do so because you will meet a lot of fabulous women. So if there was a great community intent that will always be there when I joined, it's also the women I've met that will ensure, I'm as excited in 10 years as I am in the last 3. So thank you. And now, if I talked about my experience, we wanted as part of this whole meet the board event to have a couple board members talk about their Impact Austin experiences and what board service has meant to them. Catherine is the next person who is going to share with you. So thank you, Catherine.
Well, hello. I really appreciate everybody joining, and I wish I could see everyone's faces, but I also understand, Zoom is what it is, and sometimes we don't want to be seen. So please excuse my background. I happen to be in chaos mode right now, and this was probably the best background that wasn't a virtual background. So it is really nice to meet all of you, and several of the names I certainly recognize, and hope that we can be together soon, because I am really more interested in getting back to a semi-normal as opposed to what's been called always the new normal. I'll be very brief. My journey to Impact Austin is probably different than most of you on this call. Unlike almost all of the board members, prior to being part of Impact Austin, I really was not involved in the nonprofit world in Austin. I'm a native Austinite. I'm very involved in organizations, but not necessarily nonprofit, unless you want to consider, being on the board of directors for Select Baseball when my son was growing up, or, coaching and giving times and talent to kids. That's one of it. But in terms of the actual nonprofit world, I admit I was very inexperienced. But when I joined my law firm of Enoch Keever, because I'm an attorney by trade, several of my law partners were current or prior members of Impact Austin. And I also had a really good friend, Barbara Ellis, who is not on this call, but she's recruited a ton of people, a ton of amazing women to Impact Austin. So I give her lots of credit. So my first 2 years in Impact Austin, I did grant. I was on the grant committee. First year, second year, I was a co-chair for a grant committee. And then actually during my second year, Susan came to me and said, would you be interested in being on the board? And quite honestly, I was a little shocked that she would come to me to ask me that, particularly given my lack of long-term experience, especially based on all of the experience that with really literally everyone that I seem to be meeting at Impact Austin. But after really careful thought, I came on, and we came on with a group of 5 of us that are now what I consider to be, certainly core members of the board. So I'm in my second year of the board. I am on the governance committee, and maybe that is the black bean for being a lawyer, but I'm absolutely loving it, and I've loved it not only with respect to talking about bylaws and things of that nature, but I really have had the opportunity to learn so much. And I think really that's what my first year was more about. I really felt like the board ended up giving me more than I gave to the board. But at the same time, what I have been able to garner in that 1 year experience is really what Impact Austin not only is about, but not just what the core values are about, but really the energy and the forward thinking of this group collectively. We can talk about collective giving, but I also think of this group as collective thinking. And that's really what I get from it. So I'm going into year 4, or I'm in year 4, I should say, of Impact Austin, 2nd year on the board, and I am vice president and will be the incoming president. So, you know, you see in a little snapshot of my journey, which I hope some of you can relate to, but in terms of the reason I'm so excited and quite honestly very humbled to be the incoming president starting next year, it's going to be extremely difficult to fill shoes not only of Susan, but of Lauren Paver and of past presidents, of people that I've met and learned. And I think that one of the critical things that I'm excited about really is just the collective notion of looking forward, of a well-known, well-established, collective giving philanthropic organization of women, and to help them and be a part of the pivot that we will continue to do in our new normal, and as well as really expanding what our view is of Impact Austin. You know, Deanna DeHaven, who is not on this call, was not able to be on the call, as Susan mentioned, is part of and heading up our strategic planning. And really next year, oops, sorry about that. Next year really will be the implementation of year 1 of that strategic plan. So I'm really looking forward to that, and really hope that anybody who is interested in being a part of this group in a more formalized and in a more leadership role, that you'll reach out to us.